Imagine a strip of water, right? A strip of water so incredibly narrow that if you just parked a dozen supertankers end to end, they would actually bridge the entire usable shipping lane.
Which is a terrifying visual,
Right.
honestly.
And now imagine trying to squeeze like 1/5 of the entire planet's oil supply through that gap, plus a massive percentage of all the liquefied natural gas in the world.
Every single day, without fail.
Every single day through that exact same tiny gap. And the final complication here, picture doing all of this while an adversary who is heavily equipped with modern asymmetric weaponry is just sitting in the mountains overlooking that water.
Just, watching.
Yeah,
And deciding whether or not you actually get to pass.
exactly. Welcome to the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, the physical constraints of that space are, they're the absolute crux of everything we are unpacking today.
Definitely.
Because we're looking at a geographic reality that just entirely overrides conventional economic and military models.
It really does. And that brings us to our mission for this deep dive, because we are looking at a very specific, heavily detailed strategic analysis.
Right, from a blog called Barackface.
Yeah, and the publication date here is crucial context for you listening. It's March 26th, 2026.
Right, so the author is writing this literally during the 4th week of a severe active conflict.
A conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran.
Yeah, the text serves as this real-time mechanical assessment of a massive military confrontation. It's basically an operational autopsy of a war that is currently in motion.
Which is fascinating. But before we go any further, I want to state our objective really clearly here.
And very important.
Because the source material contains some intense, heavily charged political and military viewpoints, and our role here is strictly impartial.
Absolutely. We are not endorsing any side in this conflict.
Right, we are not advocating for any specific military doctrine or action, and we certainly aren't, validating the broader geopolitical worldview of the author.
We are just here to act as analytical filters.
Exactly. Our goal is to extract the mechanical, the logistical, and the economic realities presented in this text and figure out how they interlock.
Right. We are dissecting the machinery of the crisis, not the morality of it.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the central thesis of the author's document is a direct challenge to a really common assumption.
The assumption that the U.S. Navy can just fix it.
Right. The assumption that the United States Navy, being the most powerful maritime force on Earth, can just roll into the Gulf and flip a switch to reopen the strait.
Yeah. And the author argues that reopening Hormuz is, it's militarily possible, but it is a grueling, multi-layered campaign.
It is not a switch. It is a marathon.
Exactly. And to understand why that switch is a complete myth, you have to look at the bathymetry and the topography of the strait itself.
Because geography basically dictates the tactical reality here.
Oh, 100%.
So let's start with the water. The source notes that at its narrowest point between the coast of Iran and the coast of Oman, the Strait of Hormuz is roughly 21 miles wide.
Right. But 21 miles is incredibly deceptive.
Yeah, because we aren't talking about 21 miles of open, deep ocean.
Far from it. I mean, when you are moving a very large crude carrier, a VLCC, you have to remember these things can weigh over 300,000 tons fully loaded.
Which is just an unfathomable amount of weight.
Right. So you are severely constrained by the draft of the vessel. The ship sits incredibly deep in the water.
So it can't just float anywhere.
Exactly. Much of the strait is too shallow, where it's riddled with treacherous shoals.
So because of those depth requirements and, international maritime safety corridors, the actual usable shipping lanes are tiny.
Yeah, they're only 2 miles wide for inbound traffic.
And 2 miles wide for outbound traffic.
Right, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone.
So you're taking the aorta of the global energy heart, essentially, and forcing it through a 2-mile capillary.
That's a great way to put it. And the physics of moving a vessel that massive through a channel that narrow are just unforgiving.
Because a commercial supertanker basically cannot maneuver.
No, not at all. If a threat appears on radar, you can't just throw the wheel hard to port or slam on the brakes.
The inertia is too immense. I mean, it takes miles just to bring one of those ships to a full stop, right?
Exactly, miles. And what's fascinating here is how that lack of maneuverability is compounded by the topography of the Iranian coastline.
The author calls it a narrow, violent geometry problem.
Right. If you look at the Iranian side of the strait, you are looking at the foothills of the Zagros Mountains pushing right up against the coast.
So it's not a flat beach?
No, it is a deeply jagged, elevated coastline. It's full of natural fissures, caves, complex terrain.
Which means the geometry heavily favors the ambush.
Completely. The defenders, or in this context, the attackers trying to close the strait, they hold the geographic high ground.
Right, they can just conceal mobile missile launchers inside a mountain cave, roll them out to a cliff edge, fire a volley at a slow-moving tanker that's trapped in that 2-mile lane.
And then retreat back under solid rock before a U.S. destroyer can even calculate the launch trajectory.
It's wild. The asymmetry of the environment is striking.
Because defending a commercial ship requires absolute perfection across a 360-degree dome of airspace and water.
But attacking that same ship just requires finding one brief window of opportunity from a concealed, elevated position.
Exactly. The attacker just has to get lucky once.
So the board is set. You've got 2 miles of water, surrounded by hostile mountains. And the author then provides a scorecard of where this conflict stands 4 weeks in, as of late March 2026.
And the toll is severe.
Very. Over 20 commercial ships have been hit. Persistent drone and missile harassment is ongoing.
And crucially, the text notes that U.S. intelligence estimates anywhere from 12 to dozens of sophisticated naval mines have been laid in the water.
Which is a nightmare scenario, because the deployment of those mines effectively partially closes, or at least thoroughly disrupts the strait.
Oh, the insurance markets react instantaneously to that kind of risk, which we will dig into shortly.
But the author juxtaposes that commercial toll with the military damage the U.S. and allied forces have inflicted on Iran during their same 4 weeks.
Right, the kinetic response.
Yeah, and this is where I actually found myself stopping to reread the numbers in the text.
They're huge.
They are. The source states that the U.S. Fifth Fleet, along with carrier strike groups like the Abraham Lincoln and Gerald R. Ford, have destroyed over 130 Iranian naval vessels, plus 44 mine layers, and numerous coastal radar and launch sites.
It is a massive kinetic output by the United States.
But wait, I have to ask the logical question here, and it's something the author brings up too.
Sure.
If the U.S. has already wiped out 130-plus vessels and 44 mine layers in a single month, hasn't the U.S. already won the naval battle?
You would think so, looking at the raw numbers.
Right. I mean, conventionally speaking, the opposing navy has been completely decimated. Why is the strait still effectively closed?
Well, the disconnect there is applying symmetrical World War II naval logic to an asymmetric 21st century problem.
Okay, unpack that asymmetry for me.
The author's thesis is that Iran doesn't need a traditional blue water navy to close the Strait of Hormuz.
So they don't need big destroyers.
Exactly. They don't need frigates that can go toe-to-toe with an Arleigh Burke. They just need a shadow.
A shadow. But I want to push back on the author's framing of the shadow toolkit a bit.
Okay.
Because the text lists the toolkit: an estimated 2,000 to 6,000 mines, midget submarines, fast boat mosquito fleets, Shahid drones, and NOR or C-802 anti-ship missiles.
Right. All relatively cheap asymmetric weapons.
But the U.S. military has known about these exact tactics for decades. I mean, they've run war games on this specific mosquito fleet concept since the early 2000s.
Oh, absolutely. The Millennium Challenge 2002 war game is famous for this.
Exactly. So why does the author argue that this toolkit remains so devastatingly effective despite years of U.S. preparation?
It comes down to the economic and psychological threshold for success.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the U.S. military is burdened with the requirement of absolute safety. To keep the strait open, the U.S. Navy has to ensure a massive, unarmored, highly volatile commercial vessel can pass through without a single scratch.
Because if it gets scratched, it could explode.
Exactly. But Iran's threshold for success is simply chaos. They don't need to sink the entire Fifth Fleet.
They just need to consistently hit 1 or 2 commercial ships.
Yep. And that is enough to freeze the global insurance market.
Let's talk about that insurance mechanism, actually, because the text makes it really clear that the strait is not physically closed by a wall of ships.
No, it's closed by actuaries in London.
That is wild to think about.
But it's true. The Joint War Committee in London dictates the risk premiums for global shipping.
So normally the insurance cost for a tanker moving through the Gulf is just a tiny fraction of a percent of the hull's value, right?
Right. It's a standard cost of doing business. But the moment a sophisticated mine detonates or a cruise missile strikes a tanker, those war risk premiums skyrocket.
How high do they go?
The text notes they can jump to 5, sometimes 10% of the vessel's value per voyage.
Wow. Meaning a ship carrying $100 million of crude oil suddenly costs $5 to $10 million just to insure for a single transit.
Exactly. And at that point, the profit margin for the voyage just vanishes.
So the shipping companies just stop?
Yeah, they order their captains to drop anchor in safe waters outside the Gulf and just wait.
So the physical blockade is essentially achieved through economic deterrence.
which perfectly transitions into the most alarming mathematical reality the author presents.
The cost exchange ratio.
Yes, the economics of the actual combat are terrifying.
The author details a scenario where Iran launches a drone, right? A Shahed drone,
Right. And we're talking about technology that might cost $35,000 to manufacture.
which in military terms is basically pocket change.
It's essentially a flying lawnmower engine strapped to explosives and a guidance system.
So they launch this flying lawnmower, and a U.S. destroyer detects that incoming drone.
Right. And to guarantee the safety of the convoy it's escorting, the destroyer has to fire a standard missile, an SM-2 or SM-6.
And the author points out, those interceptor missiles cost anywhere from $2 to $4 million each.
For a single shot.
I keep coming back to that math. A $2 million missile to shoot down a $35,000 drone.
It's unsustainable.
But the author seems to assume the U.S. will just willingly bleed out its multi-million-dollar interceptors indefinitely. Wouldn't the Pentagon adjust their rules of engagement?
How so?
Well, why couldn't the Navy just use cheaper kinetic options, like the phalanx rotary cannons or electronic warfare jamming, instead of burning a $2 million missile?
That's a great question. But the complication there, as the source implies, is the payload of the vessels being protected.
The commercial ships.
Right. If you are escorting a liquefied natural gas carrier, you cannot let a drone get within the 1-mile range of a phalanx CIWS gun.
Because even if the gun destroys the drone,
The fragmentation and momentum could still carry the explosive payload right into the hull of the LNG carrier.
oh wow. And the resulting secondary explosion would be apocalyptic.
Exactly. So you have to kill the threat at 20 miles out, not 1 mile out.
And killing a maneuvering threat at 20 miles requires a sophisticated radar-guided interceptor.
Precisely. And the author defines this dynamic as strategic endurance warfare.
So the adversary is intentionally using cheap, expendable munitions just to drain the U.S. wallet.
Not just the wallet, to
Yeah.
force the U.S. to deplete its deep magazine, highly expensive, and incredibly slow to manufacture interceptors.
It's a war of attrition aimed directly at the U.S. defense industrial base.
Yeah, you force America to spend itself into fatigue.
And it's just wild. But that is the foundation of the author's argument, right? That shooting down drones is not actually a strategy.
Right, it's just treading water.
So since blowing up ships and shooting down drones hasn't solved the problem, the source outlines what reopening Hormuz actually requires.
And it is a massive undertaking. To restore commercial confidence, the U.S. has to execute a 5-part comprehensive military campaign.
The text actually draws a parallel to Operation Praying Mantis during the 1987-1988 Tanker War.
But emphasizes that the modern battlefield is infinitely more lethal.
Yeah. So let's walk through this 5-part campaign in detail, because the logistical scale the author outlines here is staggering.
It really is. So, step 1 is convoy escort operations.
Which is the fastest visible fix, right?
Exactly. The mechanics of this involve grouping 5 to 10 massive commercial tankers together and surrounding them with an escort of U.S. and allied warships.
We are talking 8 to 12 destroyers, like the Arleigh Burke class, required to guard a single convoy.
And the defensive layers those destroyers have to generate are incredibly complex.
Walk me through that.
We have the Aegis combat system coordinating the airspace, constantly scanning for incoming missiles or drones.
Right.
Then you have helicopters deployed ahead of the convoy, dropping sonobuoys to listen for those midget submarines.
And electronic warfare systems actively attempting to jam the guidance frequencies of coastal radars.
It creates this impenetrable moving fortress.
But the author explicitly points out the fatal flaw in this step.
Yeah, it is completely unscalable.
Because the pre-war volume of traffic through Hormuz was immense. Dozens of vessels a day.
You simply cannot attach 2 advanced destroyers to every single commercial ship that needs to pass.
The global supply of allied warships just isn't large enough.
Exactly. The text describes it as a controlled drip, not a full bloodstream restoration.
So it gets a fraction of the oil moving to prevent a total global freeze, but it does absolutely nothing to normalize the market.
And it leaves those multi-billion-dollar destroyers tethered to slow-moving targets, burning through those expensive interceptors we just discussed.
Right. Which brings us to the element that fundamentally paralyzes the convoys. Step 2. Mine countermeasures.
or MCM,
Yeah.
and the author calls this the most agonizing operation of the entire campaign.
I believe it because a billion-dollar Aegis radar system looking at the sky is entirely blind to a weapon resting silently on the seafloor.
Yeah, it's a completely different domain. And the
Yes.
specific threat the text highlights is the Maham series mine.
Okay, we need to distinguish these from the old contact mines, right?
Mm.
The ones that float on the surface waiting for a ship to physically bump into them.
Right, the classic spiky ball mines you see in movies.
Yeah. But the Maham series are influence mines. They sit on the bottom of the strait.
They do,
Yeah.
and they are terrifyingly smart.
I was trying to conceptualize how these work based on the text. It's not a tripwire.
No, it works more like a Shazam app for submarines and ships.
Whoa, wow.
It sits there with an acoustic sensor, completely ignoring the sound of fishing boats or marine life.
So it just waits.
It is programmed to wait specifically for the acoustic fingerprint of a supertanker's massive propeller blades.
Or the massive magnetic disturbance created by 300,000 tons of steel passing overhead.
Yeah, the magnetic signature aspect is just brutally precise.
Mm.
Modern mines can detect the localized distortion in the Earth's magnetic field caused by a large vessel.
But there's an even more diabolical feature the author notes, right?
The ship counters.
Yeah. This blew my mind.
An influence mine can be programmed with a delay, so it might sense the magnetic signature of 3 ships passing and do absolutely nothing.
Lulling the convoy into a false sense of security.
Exactly. And then it detonates on the 4th ship.
It's designed to engineer pure paranoia, because if even one of those is suspected to be in the water, the convoy stops.
You have to clear the lane. And the process for clearing it, as outlined in the source, sounds excruciatingly slow.
It's like sweeping a hallway while someone is still throwing nails into it.
That's a perfect analogy, because it involves littoral combat ships deploying specialized unmanned sonar packages.
And it requires MH-60 helicopters flying low over the water, dragging heavy sensor sleds in this tedious lawnmower pattern across the strait.
And ultimately, it requires human EOD explosive ordnance disposal divers physically entering the water to neutralize the devices.
And here is the spatial reality we established earlier. They are doing this slow, methodical sweep inside a 2-mile lane.
Well within range of the Iranian coastline,
They are essentially operating in a shooting gallery.
which dictates the necessity of Step 3, offensive suppression.
The military acronyms here are C and DEAD, right?
Yes, suppression of enemy air defenses and destruction of enemy air defenses.
Because you can't sweep for mines if the helicopters are getting shot down by coastal batteries. You have to take out the launchers.
But the text describes this as an incredibly frustrating electronic cat-and-mouse game.
It's not just bombing fixed military bases.
No, because Iranian military doctrine heavily relies on mobile shoot-and-scoot tactics.
So when the text talks about striking coastal launchers with tomahawks or carrier-based aircraft, it's highlighting the difficulty of targeting.
Right. The adversary hides a modified truck carrying a missile tube inside a tunnel.
They drive it out to a pre-surveyed launch point,
They power up the radar, acquire the target, fire the missile, and drive back into the tunnel.
and the text says the entire exposure time might be less than 5 minutes.
So U.S. jets are flying in, intentionally trying to provoke those coastal radars to turn on so they can hunt the signal.
But the moment the radar powers down and the truck moves, the target vanishes.
You can have total air superiority, but finding a single truck hidden in the Zagros Mountains is a monumental intelligence challenge.
Which makes sense, and that intelligence gap is what forces planners to consider Step 4.
Which the author flags as a massive geopolitical tripwire.
Limited amphibious seizures.
Right. The logic makes sense on paper.
Because if you can't find the launchers from the air, you send the Marines to take the ground.
Exactly. You seize key islands in the strait, places like Abu Musa or the Tum Islands, to establish forward observation posts and fire control bases.
You physically rip the high ground away from the adversary.
But the author warns that this crosses an extreme escalation threshold,
Why? I mean, they're already shooting at each other.
because the Iranian forces on those islands and along the coast, specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, are heavily entrenched.
So putting U.S. Marines on the ground turns a naval standoff into a bloody, close-quarters infantry fight.
Right. Furthermore, the text suggests that seizing sovereign Iranian territory would almost certainly trigger a massive horizontal escalation.
So the war spreads.
Exactly. Iran might respond by attacking broader oil infrastructure across the entire Arabian Peninsula.
Or launching ballistic missiles at major U.S. bases in Qatar or Bahrain.
So both hosts acknowledge the source's warning here.
Yeah.
This is an extreme escalation door, and it's highly politically risky.
The author views the amphibious option as more of a theoretical threat used for leverage because executing it risks expanding the war far beyond the strait itself.
Which brings us to the final, and perhaps most strategically potent phase of the campaign outlined in the text.
Step 5. Hybrid economic warfare.
The author describes this as the chess move behind the fist.
This is where we shift from blowing things up to fundamentally altering Tehran's incentive structure.
Right, because the U.S. military might be able to slowly clear the water, but as long as Iran has the economic endurance to keep building cheap drones and mines, the cycle never ends.
You have to make the blockade hurt Iran more than it hurts the West.
And the text focuses heavily on Karg Island for this.
This is the absolute pivot point of the economic war. The author barely scratches the surface of the physical infrastructure, but the implication is massive.
Oh yeah, Karg Island is the terminal through which the vast majority of Iranian crude oil exports flow.
It handles millions of barrels.
It is the primary artery for the Iranian state's revenue.
So the author argues that if the United States and its allies can credibly threaten, blockade, or physically disrupt the export infrastructure at Karg Island, the entire strategic calculus changes.
It's mutually assured economic destruction.
The U.S. essentially says, if you choke off the global energy supply passing through Hormuz, we will enforce a localized airtight blockade on your specific ability to generate national income.
It forces the regime to weigh the tactical victory of harassing U.S. convoys against the existential threat of total state bankruptcy.
But the source lays out a sobering reality check on the timeline for this 5-part campaign.
Yeah, the timeline is not optimistic.
We've gone through the escorts, the minesweeping, the airstrikes, the economic blockades, and the author clearly states, establishing the initial, heavily guarded convoys takes days to weeks.
Right. And achieving partial mine clearance to stabilize a narrow corridor takes weeks to months.
But to actually suppress the coastline and enforce a deterrence that keeps the strait permanently open.
That is measured in years.
Years.
Yeah, the U.S. capability to drop bombs is not the limiting factor. The Iranian persistence and the mountainous geography are.
It is a grinding, multi-year commitment of naval architecture.
Which is an incredible drain on resources.
So we have this vast, incredibly expensive theater of war chewing up resources in the Gulf. But the author pivots the analysis to a question that completely rewired my understanding of the conflict.
It's a great pivot.
While the U.S. Navy is fighting this multi-year battle, who is actually absorbing the economic damage of the closed strait?
Because the assumption is usually that the primary combatants suffer the primary economic pain.
Right. But the author's macroeconomic analysis reveals a profound irony here.
The United States, despite being the military force bleeding capital to open the strait, is largely insulated from the physical shock of its closure.
Because of domestic production.
Exactly. The text points to massive domestic oil production, the shale basins in the U.S., combined with the strategic petroleum reserve.
So while gasoline prices for American consumers would certainly spike due to global market panic, the physical U.S. economy does not run dry.
The lights stay on, the trucks keep moving, the buffer holds.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Yeah.
The author shifts focus to the primary victim of the blockade, the nations of the global South.
This is a brutal distinction the text makes. For a wealthy Western economy, a spike in oil prices is an inflationary annoyance.
It changes consumer habits.
But for developing nations in Africa, South Asia, and parts of Latin America, oil is not a commodity. It is a condition of baseline survival.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the mechanics of developing economies.
Right. Many rely heavily on diesel generators to power local electrical grids.
And their food logistics networks moving crops from rural farms to dense urban centers run entirely on imported fuel.
So when Hormuz closes, the global supply of crude contracts by 20%.
And the nations that can afford to pay massive premiums, the U.S., Europe, China, will buy up whatever alternative supply exists.
While the nations that cannot afford the premium are physically priced out of the market.
The text details the cascade effect. Rolling blackouts paralyze manufacturing. Extreme food inflation takes hold instantly.
Mass unemployment spikes.
And local currencies rapidly depreciate as governments burn through foreign reserves trying to buy hyperinflated energy.
But the author uncovers an even more insidious second-order effect that is rarely discussed in military strategy.
The fertilizer crisis.
Yes. This is where it gets truly dark.
Because there is a connection buried in the text that centers entirely on how we feed the planet. Disrupting Hormuz doesn't just block oil tankers, it freezes the global maritime logistics network.
Insurance premiums spike everywhere. Shipping capacity vanishes as vessels take massive, month-long detours around Africa to avoid the Middle East.
And modern agriculture is inextricably linked to that shipping network and to petroleum products themselves.
The production of synthetic fertilizer, specifically through the Haber-Bosch process, which synthesizes ammonia, relies heavily on natural gas as a feedstock.
And Hormuz is a massive transit point for liquefied natural gas.
Precisely. You choke off the LNG, the price of the feedstock for fertilizer skyrockets.
You freeze the shipping lanes, the cost of transporting bulk urea across the ocean triples.
And the author phrases it so bluntly. Fertilizer is food production in physical form.
So when the cost of fertilizer spikes, farmers in developing nations simply buy less of it. They apply less to their fields.
And the inevitable mechanical result of that is plummeting crop yields the following harvest season.
The geopolitical reality the author is exposing here is deeply unsettling.
It is, because the text argues this cascading crisis is not an accidental byproduct of the war.
It's intentional.
It is a deliberate, calculated strategy by the adversary. By holding the Strait of Hormuz hostage, they are intentionally engineering a massive energy shortage.
That will inevitably drive food scarcity and potentially famine across the most vulnerable populations on Earth.
They're essentially taking the physical survival of the global South and weaponizing it as a bargaining chip against the West.
Which forces us to examine the ultimate endgame. If the physical starvation happens in South Asia and Africa, what is the strategic objective against the democracies of the United States and Europe?
The author defines this strategy as geopolitical blackmail and hostage-taking as statecraft.
It's a psychological war aimed directly at the political vulnerabilities of modern democracies.
The mechanism is inflation. The physical shortage hits the developing world, but the price shock hits the Western financial markets instantaneously.
A burning tanker on the evening news creates a panic in the futures markets. Energy prices soar.
And when energy prices soar, the cost of literally everything transported by a truck or plane goes up.
Groceries, consumer goods, basic services.
The author points out that democracies are uniquely sensitive to rapid inflation. Voters feel the pain at the pump immediately.
High energy prices historically lead to profound voter anger.
It breeds anti-incumbent waves, severe political polarization, and a surge in populist backlash.
The citizens start demanding answers from their elected officials.
The author's thesis here is brilliant in its dark pragmatism. The goal of closing Hormuz isn't to defeat the U.S. Navy in a decisive battle.
The goal is to inflict so much sustained, widespread economic pain on the American and European electorate that the voters force their own governments to capitulate.
They want the voters screaming, "Why is gas $10 a gallon? Why is inflation at 12%?
Stop fighting this war in the desert.
Yeah.
Make a diplomatic deal. Give them whatever sanctions relief they want. Just make the pain stop.
Exactly. They're targeting the ballot box, utilizing the democratic feedback loop as a strategic weakness.
They want to fracture the political will of the alliance before the alliance can physically clear the strait.
This brings us to the author's final critical synthesis regarding the true nature of this battlefield.
Because the U.S. military can execute all 5 steps of that campaign.
They can deploy the Aegis destroyers, they can sweep every acoustic mine from the seafloor,
They can hunt down the mobile launchers in the Zagros Mountains, and they can blockade Karg Island.
they can achieve absolute, verifiable physical control over that 21-mile stretch of water.
But the source insists that military victory does not equal an open strait.
Because the ultimate opponent is not the adversary's military. The final opponent is perception.
Commercial shipping is driven entirely by risk calculus and profit margins.
You can have an armada of warships patrolling the corridor, but if the insurance syndicates in London don't genuinely believe the environment is safe, they will not lower the premiums.
And if the premiums remain at war risk levels, the ships will not sail.
The strait is not closed when ships stop moving. The strait is closed when market confidence collapses.
So reopening it means rebuilding that confidence layer by layer until the actuaries agree the war is over.
Which leads to the author's concluding argument. Military power alone is inherently insufficient.
It can suppress the immediate threat, but it cannot independently restore the commercial reality.
Military action must be paired with diplomacy. There has to be a negotiated endpoint, a credible ceasefire, an off-ramp, a lifting of sanctions that signals to the global market that the structural threat has been removed.
Because without that diplomatic resolution, you're just committing the U.S. Navy to playing permanent bodyguard for 20% of the world's oil.
Which we've established is mathematically impossible.
The stakes of this specific conflict extend far beyond the Middle East.
The author frames this as a global referendum.
If an asymmetric actor can successfully threaten a geographic choke point, engineer global inflation, use the threat of famine in the global south as leverage, and successfully extract political concessions from superpowers,
That sets a terrifying precedent for the 21st century.
it provides a blueprint for every rogue state or heavily armed faction with access to a coastline.
It proves that the global economy can be effectively extorted for the price of a few $35,000 drones.
It forces us to confront the inherent fragility of the systems we rely on.
And it raises a critical question for anyone analyzing the future of global security.
If the entire architecture of global trade can be paralyzed by a single, narrow geometry problem, what is the viable long-term solution?
The traditional answer is to build a bigger navy. Spend billions more on advanced interceptors, drone swarms, and autonomous minesweepers to aggressively guard these choke points.
But the alternative, which the mechanics of this text strongly imply, is that attempting to militarily secure these bottlenecks is a losing game of attrition.
The true strategic defense might lie in completely decentralizing our energy grids.
Moving so aggressively toward localized energy production, renewables, and diversified supply chains that a 21-mile stretch of water halfway across the world simply loses its power to hold the global economy hostage.
You essentially bypass the choke point by rendering the cargo passing through it irrelevant.
It's a massive shift in how we think about national security, moving from defending the supply line to eliminating the need for it.
It's a fascinating thought experiment.
When we started, we talked about the illusion of robustness in the global economy. This text violently strips that illusion away,
It shows us exactly how fragile the machinery is.
and how high the cost of defending it has become. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.